The room was already tense before Mark Carney even touched the microphone. More than 200 journalists had packed into the European Parliament's main press hall in Brussels. Cameras lined the back walls. Translators adjusted their headsets. Diplomats whispered quietly to each other while reporters flipped through pages of prepared questions. Everyone knew this press conference mattered, but nobody expected it to become one of the most talked about political moments of the year. Because what happened over the next 40 minutes didn't feel like a normal press conference. It felt like a turning point. Not just for Canada, not just for Europe, but for the growing global debate about what real leadership is supposed to look like. And by the time it ended, even some of Carney's harshest critics in the room looked stunned. The reason was simple. He didn't fight the questions. He answered them. That sounds obvious, but in modern politics, it has become surprisingly rare. Most leaders today treat difficult questions like enemy attacks. They dodge, deflect, attack reporters, change the subject, raise their voice, turn everything into performance. But Carney walked into Brussels with a completely different strategy. Stay calm, stay precise, and never lose control of the room. The summit itself had already drawn international attention. Canada and the European Union were discussing deeper trade cooperation, energy partnerships, and ways to reduce economic dependence on unstable global supply chains. Behind closed doors, European leaders were growing increasingly nervous about rising tensions between major powers. Trade conflicts, tariff threats, political instability. The world economy suddenly felt fragile again, and many people wanted to know whether Canada was making things worse by standing so aggressively against American pressure. That skepticism filled the room before the first question was even asked. The opening reporter wasted no time. She stood up and immediately challenged Carney over the economic consequences of Canada's trade strategy. Her question was sharp, direct, and clearly designed to put him on the defensive. She argued that growing trade tensions were hurting global markets, increasing costs for consumers, and creating instability for European businesses. Then came the real punch. At what point, she asked, does Canada accept responsibility for the damage this confrontation is causing? The room became very still. Because it was a trap. If Carney accepted blame, he looked weak. If he denied responsibility entirely, he risked sounding dismissive. But instead of reacting emotionally, he paused for a moment and leaned slightly toward the microphone. And suddenly the atmosphere changed. He calmly explained that Canada had not started the confrontation. Canada had responded to tariffs that were already imposed first. Then he delivered the line that immediately grabbed the room's attention. If your neighbor sets your house on fire, he said calmly, the question of who caused the smoke becomes very important. You could actually feel the shift happening. Journalists who moments earlier looked skeptical suddenly started writing faster. Several people in the audience nodded immediately, not because they necessarily agreed politically, but because the answer was sharp, controlled, and impossible to ignore. And that was only the beginning. The second question came from a respected financial reporter from Germany. This one was even tougher because it relied entirely on hard numbers. The reporter pointed out that the United States represented the overwhelming majority of Canada's export market. America's economy was vastly larger. America could absorb economic damage more easily. So how, he asked, could Canada realistically believe it could sustain this confrontation long-term? Again, the room waited carefully, because economically, the numbers were real. And this time Carney didn't avoid them. He acknowledged the imbalance immediately. Then he calmly began listing numbers of his own. Canada supplies enormous portions of America's imported oil, critical minerals, fertilizer components, lumber, electricity in several border regions. One by one, he explained how deeply interconnected the two economies had become. Then came another moment that visibly changed the room. Power, he said quietly, is not only measured by size, it is measured by replaceability. That line landed hard, because suddenly the discussion no longer sounded like a small country simply fighting a larger one. It sounded like a reminder that modern economies depend on relationships nobody can easily replace overnight. Even some reporters who had prepared aggressive follow-up questions appeared caught off guard by how composed the response was. And then the mood shifted completely during the third exchange. A veteran British journalist decided to make things personal. She questioned whether Carney, a former central banker, was truly prepared for geopolitical confrontation at this level. She hinted that critics saw him as someone out of his depth, trying to challenge far more powerful leaders. The room almost expected tension at that point. Instead, Carney smiled. Not a forced political smile, a real one. And for the first time all afternoon, the room relaxed slightly. He joked that spending years managing financial crises at the Bank of Canada, and later the Bank of England, had basically prepared him for walking into chaos professionally. The audience laughed. Then he added something even sharper. "When people say I'm just a banker," he said, "I sometimes think this may be exactly the kind of situation where somebody trained to stay calm during panic is actually useful." This time the laughter became louder. Even the journalist who asked the question smiled. And that moment mattered more than people realized. Because suddenly the room no longer viewed him as defensive. He looked comfortable, confident, in control. Not because he dominated the reporters through aggression, but because he never appeared rattled by them. And then came the final question. The one everyone remembered afterward. An American journalist stood up slowly near the back of the room. His tone was serious from the very first sentence. He acknowledged Carney's performance. Then he asked the question sitting in everybody's mind. Can Canada actually win this? Not survive it. Not manage it. Win it. Could a country of 40 million people truly prevail in a confrontation against the largest economy on Earth? For the first time all afternoon, complete silence filled the room. Because suddenly this wasn't about trade details anymore. It was about confidence, national identity, power, leadership. And Carney understood that instantly. The humor disappeared from his face. The room waited. Then he leaned toward the microphone and answered with only 3 words. "We already are." Silence. Then chaos. Not political applause. Not stage cheering. Real reaction. People stood up. Journalists exchanged stunned looks. Some actually laughed in disbelief at how perfectly the moment landed. Others simply clapped harder than professional press audiences normally ever do, because the power of those 3 words wasn't just the phrase itself. It was everything that came before it. The calmness, the data, the composure, the refusal to become emotional even under pressure. By the time he said those final 3 words, the room already felt like he had won the exchange long before the answer arrived. And within hours, clips from the press conference exploded online. News networks replayed the exchanges repeatedly. Political commentators dissected every response. Social media turned the final line into headlines, memes, reaction videos, and debates across multiple countries. But what really shocked observers was how international audiences reacted. Many people weren't just responding to the politics. They were responding to the style of leadership itself. Because modern politics has become so loud that composure now feels unusual. People have grown used to leaders shouting over reporters, insulting critics, dodging difficult questions, and turning every public appearance into a performance battle. Carney did the opposite. He slowed everything down. He answered directly. And ironically, that calmness made him appear stronger. The aftermath became almost as important as the press conference itself. Analysts noted that European opinion toward Canada improved noticeably after the summit coverage. Investors began discussing Canada as a more stable long-term economic partner. Business leaders openly praised the tone and professionalism displayed during the event. Even critics admitted something important had happened in Brussels. Not because one speech solved global trade tensions. It didn't. But because leadership under pressure reveals character very quickly. And in a moment designed to provoke frustration, defensiveness, and emotional reactions, Carney stayed controlled from beginning to end. That contrast became impossible to ignore, especially at a time when global politics often feels dominated by outrage and chaos. Now, none of this means trade conflicts suddenly disappear. Real economic problems still exist. Negotiations remain difficult. Political pressure continues building worldwide. But moments like this shape perception, and perception matters enormously in international politics. Investors watch it. Allies watch it. Markets watch it. Because confidence is one of the most powerful forces in the global economy. And confidence often begins with leadership. That's why this press conference resonated far beyond Brussels. It became symbolic of something larger. A reminder that strength does not always need to look angry. That calmness under pressure can sometimes command a room more effectively than shouting ever could. And maybe most importantly, it reminded people what it looks like when a leader simply answers the question. By the end of the night, millions of people had already watched the clips online. But the most powerful moment still remained those final 3 words. Not because they sounded dramatic, but because after 40 minutes of composure, preparation, and control, the room believed them. We already are. And honestly, that may have been the moment everything changed.